So, I've made plenty of videos talking about my newfound fascination with ChocoPro. It's a wrestling show that isn't taking itself so seriously, while at the same time putting in an effort to have a high quality wrestling show that's worth watching, with it taking place in what looks like someone's garage, and without a wrestling ring to boot. It's dumb. It's very, very dumb. But that's the charm. Granted, ChocoPro might have been the brand of wrestling that finally broke me, given how the majority of their shows are among some of the highest rated shows in my book. Still, I'm more than fine leaning into the madness because, like I've said in the past, I think they're worth it. There were about 19 matches from the first season of their ChocoProLIVE series that wound up being all-time favorites of mine when it comes to pro wrestling as a whole. So as a result of that, I figured that making a list of those matches would be a good time. So, here we are. Now, I'll say right now that there aren't a whole lot of things that I can say about some of these matches, other than ChocoPro the brand itself being the biggest character that got these matches over with me, rather than take technical wrestling ability. Some matches are just over-the-top fun nonsense that I can only credit to ChocoPro for its nature and its identity. And with that being said, I'll jump right into this list with the first match. Number 19. I've stated already in past ChocoPro Live videos that I finally gave the promotion a chance earlier this year with ChocoPro Live number 80. I hated the opening match so much that I wound up trashing the entire show from the very start, and I was about as sure as I ever thought I was about anything that whatever was to come next wouldn't even be much better at all. Hell, I was about a second away from ditching ChocoPro entirely because I didn't even consider it to be a wrestling show. But what changed my mind completely was the main event that followed. It was Mesa Ruga against someone whose name escapes me at the moment, but their match completely blew me away in a way that wrestling has never done before. They had a match that defined pro wrestling in a way that I never gave much thought to outside of when I was a kid having wrestling matches with my friends in a playground somewhere, with the only difference being that in ChocoPro, these were trained professionals having the matches themselves in a similarly unprofessional way. Even the most rebellious of wrestling promotions have a wrestling ring at the very least. ChocoPro went ahead and said, nah, we don't need it. And fuck no, they didn't need it. After watching ChocoPro Live number 80, I had to give ChocoPro a fair shake. Once I found out that ChocoPro had seasons of TV and not just a continuous amount of episodes, I had my excuse to start watching from the very beginning and play catch up to where ChocoPro is today. Now at first I'll admit, the matches on the first show didn't exactly blow me away. They were alright, maybe even decent, and the vision of ChocoPro wasn't exactly all that fleshed out given that it was their first show and all. But still, even in spite of that, Bali and Aki and Minoru Suzuki had what I felt was a killer match to kick off the first ever main event of their first show. I can still call back to when Suzuki went full murder grandpa and started beating on the wrestlers that tried jumping him in the middle of the match. Suzuki in general had a knack for making his matches feel like they came straight out of an action movie, and this scene with him was like it came straight out of an action comedy for once. The match was a lot of fun and quickly made me throw away any reasonable doubt that I had about ChocoPro not being able to pull something like the main event of ChocoPro Live number 80 off again. And of course, it was far from the last time that I felt ChocoPro was able to pull something like that off more than once. Number 18, skipping ahead to a match that took place more so towards the end of ChocoPro Live's first season, Antonio Honda and Tokiko Kirihara versus Mei Saruga and Minoru Fujita on ChocoPro Live number 15 was a standard ChocoPro match, given that the standard of ChocoPro matches are some of the best wrestling content out there in the world right now. Which really all they needed to do for me to consider it so is to just have their wrestlers pull out their best shit and be totally absurd with it. Antonio Honda is the guy that ChocoPro exposed me to rather than DDT, where as far as I know, he's made his home. His zany brand of comedy wrestling for the most part did not miss for me, and really all this match was at the end of the day was everyone in the match, like Antonio Honda, just doing their thing. Mei Saruga being the chaotic ball of energy running circles around her opponent and wrestling at such a fast pace like she does, mixed with Antonio Honda's silliness was just all about that I needed, really. Not that Fujita and Tokiko didn't do their part, just that those two in particular were the ones on ChocoPro that the likes of Mei and Antonio outshined often and were the reasons why their matches worked so well and were so entertaining. Overall, this tag team match was really just another match on the show, I guess you could say, but in ChocoPro, those matches deliver in a quality that I wish more wrestling companies around the world would adopt in some way, and try as hard as everyone did in this match, while at the same time not trying to give us anything but what a television match is supposed to be. In a sense, ChocoPro as a promotion does better TV matches than any other pro wrestling company in the world right now as far as I'm concerned, and this tag team match is just one example of many. Also, speaking of which, number 17. Antonio Honda is going to be a name that shows up a lot more on this list, so if you're someone that's already tired of his shtick or never found him all that entertaining in the first place, then this list is most likely not one you're going to agree with all that much. But maybe at least for this match, you'll give me a bit of a break. Antonio has a tendency to control almost every match that he's in and treat it as his own, based off of how his unusual brand of comedy is so boisterous and ridiculous on this show compared to your average, everyday fundamental wrestling match, which you really don't get a lot of on ChocoPro in the first place. Which is why Antonio Honda flourishes as much as I think he does in this promotion. This match took place in the main event of their 8th episode of ChocoProLIVE, which was dedicated to Sayaka in a 10-year anniversary match. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I knew anything about Sayaka prior to ChocoPro, but wrestling can be a language that both transcends language barriers and historical ones, I guess. I didn't need to be around watching Sayaka wrestle for all of the 10 years that she's been wrestling to understand the emotion in this match. It got a little bit too serious and maybe even a bit too cheesy at the end of the match, but I still enjoyed it, but even for as far as it deviated from the nature that I thought ChocoPro was. This match, if anything, showed me that even this promotion can pull off a serious match every once in a while, in between all the borderline satirical wrestling stuff that I've come to appreciate it for. I can't say much else other than it was a job well done by both wrestlers. Number 16. Have I mentioned yet in this video that ChocoPro does intergender wrestling probably better than most wrestling companies in the world right now? Because they do. And on top of that, they make it look easy. On the 7th episode of ChocoProLIVE, Yunamizu Mori and Bali Aki had by all means a standard ChocoPro match, but thanks to the nature of the promotion, almost effortlessly put on a match that was far more entertaining than it probably had any right to be. It's impressive how the promotion is able to pull off intergender matches without ever having me question it much at all, whereas for many other wrestling promotions, it's taboo. It's one of ChocoPro's biggest strengths, and I can't say enough good things about Yuna and Aki either. Number 15. I'm pretty sure that it was the 2nd episode of ChocoProLIVE that was the one to break me completely, and subsequently lead me to losing my entire fucking mind when it came to what I felt at the time was my borderline irrational fascination with the promotion. Emi Sakura versus An Chamu, I think I'm pronouncing that name correctly, was a match on the show that was firing on all cylinders for me and benefited from the momentum of the show while not having to deliver some 15-minute back-and-forth contest. Hell, the entire 2nd episode of ChocoProLIVE was the first to earn my first ever 10 out of 10 rating, a score that I didn't even think would be all that possible to reach for me, and I'm pretty sure that this episode was the one that broke me. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'm completely fine with that. Number 14. More often than not, Mei Suruga's matches always hit for me. Not only when it comes to ChocoPro, but when it comes to wrestling, Mei is my favorite to watch without question. Bali and Aki and Yunamizu Mori are more than capable of pulling off this level of a match on their own, but even when Mei's matches don't wind up the same quality of the match as this one, I still enjoy her work more than anyone else on the show. She's the ace, in my opinion. As for the match itself, there isn't much that I can say about it besides being one of those wild ChocoPro matches that, once again, just live up to the promotion's competitive and yet silly identity. Everyone got their shit in, it was wild, and it had no right being as high quality of a match as it was. Totally worth checking out. Number 13. So I'm pretty sure that this was the only time that Veni ever competed for ChocoPro in the first season, and her one and only opponent on that season was Mei Suruga. Hey, I was down as soon as I heard this match was taking place on the card for their 16th episode, and the match itself delivered even more than I expected it to. This episode took place right around the time that the wrestling world found out that Hana Kimura passed away, and I remember when they made their tribute to her at the start of the show, I thought that this episode would be a difficult one to get through with the same brand of comedy that I've come to know and love from ChocoPro. Yet still, not only did that episode fly by without a hitch, but the main event with Mei and Veni, and even with Veni being as close to Hana as she was, still kicked ass. She seemed completely in control of her emotions, as was everyone else on the show, which I'd imagine that the majority of the people that had issues controlling their own after Hana's passing was in a way therapeutic to see. If anything, all I can really say about the main event of the match itself is that Veni seemed to really live up to the fantasy of What if so-and-so showed up to the ChocoPro promotion for a match? Man, that'd be awesome, wouldn't it? It's so easy to dismiss the fantasy entirely when it comes to companies like WWE beating them into the ground by turning your favorite wrestler from NXT into a complete dumbass and pairing them off in matches you never asked for. It's a benefit that Chocolate Square, ChocoPro's venue, much like say the Temple in Lucha Underground, tends to be their greatest character on the show. Venny vs. Mei Suruga wound up being every bit as competitive and as fun as you would expect from ChocoPro. Number 12. Ah yes, the debut of Lettuce Chan taking on the undefeated Antonio Honda in an attempt to end his streak. If you needed any more explanation as to why I think ChocoPro has led me to lose my whole entire mind as a wrestling fan, look no further than the description I just gave for this match. And then go out of your way to watch the match itself, and try to make sense of Antonio Honda's attacks and why in the world it would get over so huge with me. I'm sorry, but the dude is fucking entertaining to watch. It doesn't matter how stupid his shtick is, it's great. And obviously, May's no slouch either. This was classic ChocoPro right here. Number 11. Mei Suruga vs. Yuna Mizumori in a time limit draw. Two of Emi Sakura's students having a Young Lion-esque match of sorts. I gotta be honest though, I wasn't as much of a fan of their Iron Man match as I was a fan of this one. When it comes to matches like that Iron Man match like they had to live up to their own billing even for a promotion that doesn't take itself too seriously. It was a great match, but it wasn't what it could have been. Here in their time limit draw, it had no hype around it other than two of the show's biggest characters clashing like young lions, throwing everything that they had against each other, and it ending without a winner in a way that didn't suck, which is incredibly hard to pull off in wrestling, and props to ChocoPro for not abusing that gimmick like some other companies. The match was just fun from start to finish and featured two of ChocoPro's main characters. There wasn't much more that this could have been. Number 10. And now cracking the top 10, we have Antonio Honda versus Unamon in a match that took place in the second episode of ChocoPro, an episode that I mentioned earlier being the first ever wrestling show to get a 10 out of 10 score from me. I firmly believe in the phrase in wrestling that when you're hot, and when you're not. Because when a wrestling show is starting off hot, then it's very difficult to bring the show down unless you bring to the table something that's complete garbage. Yuna versus Antonio was a match that started off the show hot with the unusual competitive comedy that ChocoPro is known for. But given that this was one of the very first times that I've seen it, the episode as a whole holds a special place in my book. Number 9. The same goes for the main event on that second episode of ChocoPro. Now these days, I'm not all that big on Ryo Mizunami after that embarrassing match that she had with Hikaru Shida for the AEW Women's Championship at the very end of a tournament that delivered some of the greatest matches all year round in 2021. It was a shitty ending to a match that I was really looking forward to, and like most things in wrestling that take the trip over to AEW for a spell, it winds up turning into dog shit. For as much as I wanted to forget things like AEW diehards calling Ryo Hulk Hogan but cooler, I just fucking can't. It's gonna take some time for me to want to see her wrestle again after the damage that her run in AEW had on her image, but at least I have hope that she'll quickly remind me what I enjoyed so much about her throughout her entire AEW Women's Championship tournament prior to the finals. Here in this match, she did a fine job, as like everyone else did on the show that was white hot from my point of view. The worst thing that I can say about it looking back is that Ryo just kind of makes me cringe. For 8. This match was just more of Antonio Honda being Antonio Honda. I can't stress enough how stupidly entertaining the guy is when he's in his bag on these shows. Number 7, I can't say much about this match other than it being another ChocoPro match that lives up to the concept of the show. I'm beginning to sound like a broken record at this point, I think. Number 6, alright. So as of right now, I'm on the first episode of Season 3, and now that I've finally finished watching the entire second season, I can say that Lulu has finally won me over, at least a lot more than I ever thought she would. I said in previous ChocoPro reviews that whenever Lulu's had a match that I enjoyed, I typically chalk it up to the wrestler that she's performing against, and in this case, it was Antonio Honda. Surprise, surprise. But I will say this, it does take two to tango. I know that a lot of wrestling fans would often make the joke of a wrestler being so good that they can have a match with a fucking broomstick and make it look competitive, but I still do believe at the end of the day that even for when one wrestler is far more entertaining or better in the ring than the other, It still took an effort from everyone involved in that said match. With Lulu, I had always seen something in her going all the way back to this match, and probably is my best example of that. But throughout the majority of the second season of ChocoPro, that something became less and less of what I hoped it was. She wasn't as entertaining as her fellow ChocoPro roster members. Now I have a good reason to think otherwise, reasons that I'll no doubt be getting into my top 20 ChocoProLIVE matches of Season 2 in the near future. But as for her match with Antonio Honda, and as her one and only match on this list, credit goes more so to Antonio for being absurd as he is. Number 5. So this last man standing match had a special vibe to it. By the end of it, you could tell that Yuna threw everything that she had against Fujita, and because of this match, ChocoProLIVE episode 11 became the third ever wrestling show to earn a 10 out of 10 score from me. It was everything that you'd expect from wrestlers and the promotion, and it did a good job in getting Yuna over with me when I had my doubts about her prior to the match. It also did wonders for her character on this show, given that not so long after this she started throwing temper tantrums about not being able to win the ChocoPro tournament at the end of the show. A more than worthy match to crack the top 5 on the list, and one of the biggest matches on the season without question, even without a long build prior to it taking place. Number 4. So I've already mentioned the second episode of ChocoProLIVE being the first ever show to get a 10 out of 10 for me overall, and I just mentioned how the 11th episode wound up being the third ever show to do that as well. But in case I failed to already mention the second show to ever get the elusive score for me, I'll mention it here when it might be sorely needed. The third episode of ChocoProLIVE was the one that I thought was pretty much perfect from top to bottom. And if I had to choose which show out of the 3 to put the top of the list as the absolute best episode of the first season, it's episode 3. The main event on that show was hands down some of the most fun that I've ever had watching ChocoPro. Everyone involved had outstanding chemistry with each other, with Chris Brooks and Mei Saruga being reluctant goofball tag team partners with their crazy height difference being a factor that played into the match really damn well, to the completely absurd use of the windows when Mei Saruga at one point got locked out of the match completely and seeing her bang on each window try to get back in. At this point, I've seen them use the window countless amount of times, but this was the first and probably the most fun. It got over huge with me. Then there was Emi Sakura playing to the camera when she suddenly gets kicked out of frame thanks to a tag team move between Mei and Chris in one of the most memorable spots of the entire season just because of how creative it was. This match was just full of some of my favorite moments from wrestling in the year 2020, period. It's legitimately one of the best examples that I have as to why I just had to stick it out with the entire first season, and why I fell so head over heels with the promotion. Strong recommendation for me, although I do have to warn you that it might just be too absurd for you if the competitive comedy stuff isn't for you. And if that's the case, I'm surprised you're even tuning into this list. Number 3. And now cracking the top 3, the final match of the first season. I said in my review for the Double Birthday Blast episode that this match was everything that I wanted it to be, even with the Yuna being annoying at the very start of the match and making whatever the hell that noise was supposed to be. I guess it was supposed to be heard and Fujita's warrior cry or something. It's not that the entire season was building to this match or anything, just that it was a match that made the season go out with a bang. Number 2. The final 2 matches on this list are, surprisingly enough, 2 matches that I don't have a whole lot to say about. I guess in a sense, they kind of speak for themselves from my point of view. Mei vs. Fujita was really all about Mei in my opinion. She was the MVP of the entire season and is the MVP of ChocoPro entirely. She's probably my favorite wrestler to watch in all of wrestling. Mei's that damn entertaining to watch. Fujita's no slouch, sure, but she's one of the biggest draws for me when it comes to the promotion and getting to see Mei do her thing. Of all the characters on the show, Mei's the most striking of them all, even with Yuna's character development throughout the entire season, or Antonio Honda being as entertaining the whole way through like he was. I feel as if Mei is the golden goose that gets overlooked by fans during the first season, and matches like this one is one example of why, but not the last. Which, having said all that, led to my number 1 pick as the best match on the entire first season, Mei Saruga vs. Sayaka Obihiro on ChocoProLIVE episode 10. Maybe some of you who checks out the list might go watch this match for yourselves to see what the hype is about and might not see what I'm getting at with this match being at the top of my list. And to that, all I can really say is that it just kind of wound up that way. I just felt that the chemistry that these two had was that outstanding. Even though it was a match that wasn't exactly treated as anything other than another match on the card. And I want to preface what I'm about to say with what I feel is a reasonable comparison to the point that I'm going to make. I was not a fan of Daniel Bryan in 2014. I tuned out of wrestling altogether during his reign at the top of the company while he was in the middle of what I felt was a storyline that was so bad in being the authority that I just didn't have it in me to give a fuck about his chase to becoming the top guy in that company. At the time, I just didn't get it or really care about the crowd going absolutely insane over a guy that knew a bunch of submissions. He was more entertaining to me when he was a heel losing his mind over Kane and AJ, not as the underdog. If anything, all that love that he got reeked as a bunch of fans growing spoiled and wanting to see him at the top, not because that's what they really wanted, but because they just wanted to get their way. And the reason why I'm bringing this up in the first place is to say that over time, I've kind of began to see that a bit differently, if not entirely. I still feel the same way about his run as I did then, but now I understand that there were fans that legitimately bought into the Yes movement because they were huge Daniel Bryan fans, even though the guy wasn't Hulk Hogan or The Rock in terms of what you define as the most typical true wrestling superstar. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not sitting here and comparing Mace Saruga to Daniel Bryan. What I'm trying to get at is that Mace Saruga is what Daniel Bryan in a way was to a fan that was a big fan of Daniel Bryan of all people in WWE. Not the wrestler you'd expect, but at the same time the exact thing you expect from wrestling. Basically sitting here trying to describe why Mace Saruga of all fucking wrestlers is the one that was my favorite to watch throughout the entire season. To maybe some people that I think just wouldn't get it when watching her wrestle in a similar way as to what I just didn't get with Bryan. You just kind of choose them without ever making a choice. Once upon a time, Becky Lynch was my favorite to watch right until she turned heel, but unlike Becky and some of my other faves, Maze had more matches that wound up being all-time favorites in my book than just about the majority of literally anyone else in wrestling. Like I said at the start of this list, I'm pretty sure that the absurdity that is ChocoPro caused me to lose my entire whole fucking mind as a wrestling fan. And I've been pretty okay with that for a while now. So yeah, that was my top 19 matches of ChocoProLIVE Season 1. That's all for me until the next season.